Hello everybody, welcome to today's webinar. Today we're giving an introduction to AWS CloudFormation. Just to give you a heads up, you won't need to record today's session. We will email you on Thursday or Friday with the recording today. And what to do is please use Zoom Q&A for your questions. If you are using our YouTube stream, please post your questions into YouTube. We do also have a community Slack that you can join on octopus.com/Slack. If you pop your questions into the webinar channel, we'll get to them at the end of today's session. So today I'm joined by Sarah Lee. Hey Sarah, how are you today?
I'm good, thanks, Derek. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm all the better for chatting to you today, of course. I'm really looking forward to this. I think this will be a really great webinar. Obviously, looking at obviously we've ran through this a few times. I think this is going to be a really great introductory session for today's webinars attendees. So, at this point, I'll get out your way and let you get stuck in.
Thanks, Derek. So yeah, as Derek said, we're going to be talking about AWS CloudFormation. Now, I do admit that this has pushed me out of my comfort zone a little bit, folks, because I am more Azure related, but it's been actually fun learning about AWS and AWS CloudFormation. So on today's agenda is we're going to cover off a bit of the basics about AWS, just introducing what that is and what that platform is. We'll then start to talk about AWS CloudFormation and where it sits in the infrastructure as code language set and tool set that you may want to use. And then we'll look at how you can actually automate your deployments using Octopus Deploy Runbooks. So this is definitely going to be an introductory webinar, folks, so I hope you enjoy it. Now, AWS is an acronym that we probably have heard quite a bit around the IT department. Now, AWS means the Amazon Web Services. Now, Amazon Web Services was an internal project, if you didn't know this. And what happened was people were using it internally and they decided that, do you know what? This might actually be a great business model and we might actually use this. So this is where it came from, and this is how AWS came to be a cloud platform that we now have today. And it's been around since about 2004, so it's quite a mature product. Now, there's lots of different things that you can use and do within AWS, and there's a whole host of things that we could talk about today, but I just want to give you a quick brief and overview of what's happening and things I've learned while I've been researching this webinar. Now, one of the differentiating factors between all of the cloud providers is probably where they sit regionally and where their data centers sit. Because if you are a customer, say in the UK, you potentially want to keep all of your IT services, despite having them in the cloud, somewhere in the UK as well. So having that UK data center provided by your cloud provider is essential for you. Now, having a look at this map, every blue dot represents a region that Amazon currently have live. The orange ones are the ones that have been announced. So right now, Amazon have 26 regions available for you. Now, inside each region, you have multiple availability zones. And availability zones are physical data centers where computers are separated and live, and they're separated on that geographical region, so you can try and mitigate if a local disaster were to happen in your region. Now, as I said, they have 84 availability zones and they're planning 24 more availability zones with 8 new regions coming on board. So there's a whole plethora of regions that you can pick if you wanted to actually use AWS. Now, one of the main factors of using cloud is the fact that you can get spun up quite quickly and you can go global in a matter of minutes. Now, I remember the days where I used to work for companies, and if we were opening up a new office somewhere, potentially in another country, we would often set off on an expedition out to that country and have a look at office buildings and understand where we could potentially put our data center and our server room inside that office block, understanding how many power units we would need, how many plugs we would need, if we had to have air conditioning, all the logistical things that you might have to think about if you're starting up a new office. However, using the cloud, you don't have to do that. You can just look at the services and the regions available to you and say, right, we need to open up an office in New York. Where can we put our services? And you pick a cloud provider, and within minutes, you can have that office, you can have that infrastructure set up and running. So there's a lot of advantages to using cloud platforms. Now, when we look at AWS and what it offers, we have a whole host of AWS services. Now, I've picked a few, I think there's about 10 icons on screen right now, showing you some of the services that they have inside AWS, but there'll be hundreds, if not thousands, of services available to you under the categories of things like compute, serverless, databases, developer tools, security, monitoring, analytics, containers, customer engagements. There's tons of things that you can use. What I have enjoyed looking at and learning about in AWS is some of the services that they have and some of the icons that they actually have. Now, in the top right-hand corner, one in from the right, you'll see a detective logo. And this is actually quite a cool service. And I did pick this deliberately because that actually represents the Amazon Detective Service, which makes it easy to analyze, investigate, and quickly identify the root cause of potential security issues or suspicious activities. And I think that's a pretty cool service, and I really like the logo as well. So it's fun to see Amazon playing with the names of their services and the logos as well. And it's a pretty colourful array of services that you have available there as well. Now, in terms of interacting with AWS, there's lots of things that you can actually do in different ways that you can use AWS. So probably the first way that you'll do it if you're starting off within AWS is using the management console. And this is just a graphical user interface that you would view in your web console. So you would open up your favorite web browser, you would put in the AWS URL, and you would start to use it just like any other website that you have available to you. Now, you might start to then get a bit more advanced and look at something like the AWS command line tools and either use that locally on your machine or using the Cloud Shell built into the Amazon management console. Then, if you get a wee bit more advanced, you might actually start to use AWS SDKs or the software development kits that are available to start to programmatically control how your services or your applications or your infrastructure actually react and how you deploy them as well. So there's lots of ways that you can actually interact with it. I tend to stick with the management consoles. They are pretty good, although there are some inefficiencies with them as well. And this is where we actually start to think about using the cloud in a much more complex manner. Now, the cloud is great for being able to spin up really quickly and allowing you the flexibility of doing different things. However, when you start to do it at scale, when you start to implement complex infrastructure and you start to look at infrastructure across maybe multiple regions, multiple availability zones, building in backups and disaster recovery, it can be quite complex, and managing that through the management console isn't great. You know, if you have a management console and you're walking through the wizard, you do have lots of options and lots of flexibility. However, you might, as a human being, miss a box. You might miss that tick box that enables the backup for that virtual machine you're spinning up. And guess what? If you've forgotten about that or you've missed that, that could cause a massive issue for your organization. And what we really want to do is have a consistent, repeatable, and reliable way of trying to deploy our infrastructure. So that if I was deploying my infrastructure, it would be the exact same way that if one of my colleagues, maybe Derek, was actually deploying the infrastructure as well. And this is where we start to introduce the notion of infrastructure as code. Now, infrastructure as code is really just a text file, a template, a list of commands that actually deploy your infrastructure and deploy them in a way that is consistent and a way that will be the same every time. And it makes it so that you don't have to, as a human being, worry about did you turn on backups. You can have the template instructed to actually do all of that for you. So it's quite good in being able to do this. And there's a whole host of tools out there that you can use for infrastructure as code. You've got things like Terraform, you've got Pulumi, you've got maybe Azure Bicep, and this is where AWS CloudFormation comes into play, because AWS CloudFormation is the native infrastructure as code tooling that you can use to deploy your AWS resources. Now, as I said, infrastructure as code is a simple way of creating and managing your resources by provisioning and updating them in a predictable way. And that's where we can actually start to use these templates. Now, when I've been researching AWS CloudFormation, I've learned a few things about how the templates are actually made up. So if we have a look at them, you can actually write your AWS CloudFormation templates in 2 different languages. So you have a choice here. So you can either use JSON or you can use YAML as the language within your template. Now, I think both of those, JSON and YAML, are both love-hate things that we have within the IT industry. I know I love JSON sometimes, and I also equally hate it, and the same with YAML. Today, what I'm going to be doing, though, is focusing on the YAML template. So I'll be demoing some of the YAML templates that I've created for you. However, I'll also show you how you can take a YAML template and convert it into JSON if you wanted to, quite easily, or vice versa. You can take a JSON template that you might find and then convert it into a YAML template. Now, with templates, you have a couple of options you can do to get started with them. So you can take a blank page, so you can open up your text editor, your IDE, and create a blank template and start from scratch. Or you could go out on the internet and have a look for some examples or ones that people have shared and created, and they're open source and available for you to take, modify, use, learn from, and build upon. Or with AWS CloudFormation, we actually have a designer, a graphical user interface designer that you can drag and drop icons onto, and then it will start to build out the template for you as well. So there's a couple of options that you can use depending on your level of skill, your level of knowledge, and where you are on that journey about using infrastructure as code. Now, with your AWS CloudFormation templates, there are 9 main objects that some templates will have. Some of them are optional and some of them are mandatory within your template. If we have a look at our template structure here, we have a template on the left-hand side, and this will be a template that I'll be deploying later on in my demo. But we can see on the right-hand side, we have the main objects of this template. So let's walk through these main objects, because I think it is quite key to understand how this template could be potentially structured. And especially if you go out into the internet and pull up some samples and have a look at them, you want to be able to understand what you're reading and why you're reading them and why there's certain functions or bits inside your template. So the first one, the first line of your template will be the format version. Now this defines the capabilities that your template will have. Now, believe it or not, the current version of the AWS CloudFormation format version is 2010-09-09. So you'll see all of the templates out there, hopefully, with that format version. That's the only valid version that you can use, and that's the most recent version that's available to you. The other parts that you might see at the start of your template are around metadata and description. And both of these are used to describe what the template does or provide some additional information about what that template does, either for yourself so that you can see what you've been writing and what you've been doing later on, or sharing with your colleagues or peers, or even open sourcing with everybody on the internet. Now, the next section that you might see inside a template is parameters, and those are used to define values that you'll later on pass through the template. Now, in this example, I haven't got any parameters because we don't actually need any parameters to be able to deploy what is essentially a storage bucket or a storage account within AWS. So that is an optional one that you may or may not see within your templates. Now, the next 3 are actually really advanced options. They're mappings, conditions, and transforms. Now, a mapping is really a lookup table again, so you can change values throughout your template. Your conditions are things like, if this is happening somewhere else in the template, do this. And that can be quite useful, especially if you're starting to deploy templates across multiple regions and looking at more complex scenarios. Now, the transform is around building a simple declarative language for CloudFormation, and again, trying to reuse other parts of templates within your template. Now, as I said, those 3 components within a template are quite advanced, so we're not going to be covering them in detail today, but they are something that you may come across, again, if you're looking at other templates on the internet. Now, something that you'll see inside every AWS CloudFormation template that you come across is the resources section, and you always have to define at least one resource inside your template. In this example, I am defining what my S3 bucket or my storage account within AWS will actually look like. I'm declaring the setup of it, whether I have public or non-public access to my storage account, whether there's encryption enabled on it. You can define anything in this section, whether that is an AWS resource like an S3 bucket, or whether it's a virtual machine, or it could actually be an identity role that you're actually defining inside of that. So as long as you're defining one resource, then your template is valid within AWS CloudFormation. Now, the last section is outputs, and this again is an optional part, but this allows you to return some values from once the template has been created. In this example, I'm outputting the name of the S3 bucket that will be created because I'm not in control with my template here of what the name will be. So I want to have that back so that I can have a look at it and take a note of it, potentially either to use in another template deployment or something else that's happening within my deployment as well. We'll see later on where we actually output the IP address of an IP that we actually create for a virtual machine so that I can go and check and do some potentially maybe smoke tests or just click on that link and see what's happening inside of it. So the output section is quite useful, again, for sanity checking or for later on doing something more complex on your deployments. So how does AWS CloudFormation work? What is the actual process of taking that template? So what you first want to do is either get your template, so get one from another source or create one from scratch, either in, like I said, YAML format or in JSON format. You'll save that code either locally on your machine or you can upload it into an S3 bucket and be able to call it from there. And from there, once you've done that, you go into CloudFormation, either through the browser or through the command line or through even an API, and create what's called a stack that will then deploy that template. So AWS CloudFormation will take that template that you've written and it will actually transform it into the resources and deploy it. So provision whatever you've asked it to provision and configure whatever you've asked it to configure. So there's those 4 key stages that every CloudFormation template will actually go through. So as I said at the start, there's a kind of issue when we're starting to deploy complex deployments inside the cloud, and we need to think about how we solve that, and that's where infrastructure as code can come into play. So why would you want to do that? And let's just reiterate some of those problems that we talked about. So as we can be fast and consistent with every deployment, we want to be able to actually, make my deployment the same as my colleague's deployment. So again, we're relating to everything that our organization wants. So all of those restrictions or maybe implications that our security team have asked us to do when we deploy a certain resource type is actually happening every time someone does it, and it's not dependent on myself or the security team making sure that that happens. It's written into the template and we're having that consistent approach. Often also deploying through a template and through infrastructure as code is a lot faster than walking through a GUI and double checking if you've ticked a tick box or where to find that tick box because the GUI has changed and things like that. So we want to avoid some of those issues as well. It also kind of frees up your operations team because often your operations team are the team that will deploy your infrastructure out or your resources out to your cloud provider. However, it's not always great for a developer, say, to have to wait for your operations team to be able to deploy that or find that ticket in their ticketing queue and actually action it. So if you have templates, you can actually start to look at allowing your developers to be able to deploy the resources that they need at will. But again, developers are traditionally not people that maybe know how to do resources or deploy resources. So having that template means that they can take that and deploy it. And again, they are being able to self-service themselves and actually follow the organizational standard as well, because a template, hopefully, if it's built right, will have all of that built into it and they can stay within the guidelines of the organization. And this is also where Octopus Deploy Runbooks can help, because we as operations people can set up a runbook and then a developer can go along and quickly press on the run button and deploy that template, again, quite easily, quite efficiently, and again, within the guidance that we want our resources deployed in. Now, that's not the only use for Octopus Deploy Runbooks. We've also seen people do database management with them. We've seen people create support tickets and support emails through that, even running smoke tests on their infrastructure after it has been deployed. Or we've even seen people using runbooks to calculate DORA metrics. So there's lots of use cases for runbooks, but today we're going to be focusing on how you use runbooks with your infrastructure as code deployments. Now, I've talked a lot about the theory, so let's dive in to actually seeing a template and start to deploy that out. So if I jump over to my Visual Studio Code, what I have here is that template that I showed you on my slide deck. So we have the exact same template here that would build my S3 storage account or S3 bucket into my AWS environment. So like we said in the slide deck, we have those different sections. So we have the format version, we have a description, and then this larger section here is defining what my S3 bucket will look like. Now there's various different things that I've set up inside here. What I'm making sure is that I want my S3 bucket to be private. I don't want it to be publicly available to everybody on the internet. So I'm making sure that all public access is locked down. I'm also making sure that encryption is actually in play here as well. And we've got versioning configuration as well. And last but not least, in the output section, I have the name of my bucket, because as you'll notice from this template, I'm not defining a name with a parameter, or I'm allowing AWS to pick the name based on what this template is doing, and it'll just generate a random name for me. So how do I deploy this? I want to head over to my AWS environment and we'll have a look at the management console from there. So this is the AWS Management Console, and I'm already in the CloudFormation section, and this is what it would look like if you would go to it as well. Now you can see my colleagues have been deploying some stacks and some templates already, so they're already there for us. However, how do we deploy that S3 bucket template? Well, we click on Create Stack. Now we have two options. We have creating with new resources or modifying existing resources. That's something that you can use if you already have a bunch of services that have been deployed to AWS out with of a template and you now want to actually template them. We are going to start from scratch, so we'll pick with new resources. Now you have a few options here when you go in to create a new stack. You can create your own, you can use your own template, so template is ready, or we could pick from a sample template. Or we can actually create a template in the designer, in that graphical designer that I talked about. We're going to say template is ready because we have our template. And then we can either say this template lives in an Amazon S3 storage account, or we can upload it from my machine. So let's upload it from my machine. So the template has been uploaded and we have this option to view it in the designer. So let's click on View in Designer. Now, because my template is fairly simple, we're going to get a very simple function back into it. So let's see if we scroll out. There we go. We have my small S3 bucket icon showing me that that's representative of what the template is doing. If we look down the bottom half, we'll see our actual template, and we have it formatted in YAML. If, like I said, you want to use JSON instead, but you found a YAML template, what you can do is actually paste it into this designer. And if you click JSON, it will actually show you the other version. So you can flip between the versions. So I did find some JSON templates out there on the internet that I wanted to use, but I still wanted to use YAML. So I was able to put them into the designer and then transform them into YAML, so that was my preferred language of choice. So you have that option of being able to convert a template if you find it or need to convert it. You could additionally add in things here. You could drag them in. So if you wanted to add in a backup vault here, you could drag that over and it would start to build up that template for you. However, we just want to deploy this simple S3 bucket. So what we'll do is we'll click on the Create Stack and we'll go back to the wizard. So we've uploaded our template, so we want to hit Next to this. So we have to enter a name for the stack deployment. So we want to reference this something that will make sense to us later on, and potentially will make sense to my colleagues as well if they were to go into here. So I'll type in Sarah and we'll call it storage, keeping it simple. There's no parameters defined inside the template, and that's okay for this example. So we have nothing to input or nothing to change here. We then have some additional options. Now we could add more tags here to identify the resources that are being created. Again, maybe again for your organizational purposes, for monitoring purposes, for identification purposes. I'm not going to add in any more tags. However, I would say that tagging all of your resources in any cloud provider is something that you should do. It's best practice and it will help you down the road as you start to grow more resources. You'll start to do more cost management, more monitoring. The tags can actually start to help you with a lot of that. Now, the next section is permissions, and we're going to ignore this at the moment. However, I want to highlight that this isn't necessarily best practice. So the account I'm logged into has full admin rights as a root user to my AWS account. What you really should do here is create a separate IAM role, or identity and access management role, and have it limited permissions so that it only has the rights to maybe deploy your CloudFormation templates. However, as we're still learning and we're still building up our knowledge, I'm going to use my root account, but it isn't best practice. So please don't do this in production environments, but it's the easiest way to start to build up your knowledge and start to get familiar with how you deploy resources within CloudFormation. So yes, please don't shout at me for not following best practice here. We have some options around what happens if the template deployment or stack were to fail. So what would happen if we were deploying lots of resources and something would fail halfway along the template? Would we roll back all of our resources? Would keep there's so many resources that have been provisioned? We're going to take the default because it's a simple template and it should just deploy itself. There shouldn't be any failures. And again, there's more advanced options here if you wanted to maybe send a notification once the template had been created and the resource was available, or again, about deletions and different things around the stack. We're going to leave these all as default because we're still trying to build up our knowledge around doing AWS CloudFormation deployments. Now, the last screen is just summarising all of the options that we've picked or haven't picked for this deployment. We have this button here that's quite useful because it'll take you through to the AWS pricing calculator and show you how much it would actually cost to deploy out this template. Again, because we're very simple and we're only just doing an S3 bucket, the cost will be minimum and we will actually be deleting it in a few minutes anyway, so it shouldn't cost us too much. But that's an option that you can do, again, if you're trying to understand what a template does. So let's hit create stack and hopefully create this S3 bucket. So what happens here is you get this screen showing you the events, the resources, the outputs, various different things that are happening along with this template. Now, it should only take a few moments because we're deploying one resource and a very simple one. If we hit the refresh button, we're getting information about what AWS and what AWS CloudFormation is doing in the background. So we can see those stages again. If we were deploying a more complex template, we'd be able to see the different stages that it was going through. So we can see here now that it's completed and it's actually deployed that template for me, and I now have my S3 storage bucket. If I click on resources, I'll be able to see the storage account. I've even got a link here that will take me off to that storage account. So if we click on that, here we have my S3 bucket. My storage account has been created. If we have a look at properties, we'll be able to see some of the properties that we configured inside the template. So I've got bucket versioning enabled. I've got encryption enabled. If we have a look at permissions, it should hopefully tell me that yes, there's no public access enabled for this bucket as well. So it's done exactly what we wanted the template to do and created that storage bucket for me. Now, if we head back into my CloudFormation, we can see the outputs as well. So there's the name. So when we defined inside the template, the output, that's given it back for us. So we have that if we needed it, and we can take note of that for later on. What I actually wanted to show you while we were inside this portal is the big delete button. Now, you may be like me and you like to tidy up as you go and have clean consoles, and you know, if you've had a completed run, you might want to delete it because it's completed and you're happy with it. However, there's one thing to notice here. When you hit the delete button inside this, it will actually delete all of the resources that you have deployed unless you've got a deletion policy that says that it's not going to do that. So by default, that delete button will actually delete not only the stack deployment and clean up your console, it will actually delete all of the resources that have been created by that template. So in this case, my S3 bucket would be deleted. Now, for me, that's not catastrophic. It's not an issue because it's a demo. It's not a production workload. However, I have heard stories from people that they have deleted that by mistake, and they've deleted production environments, and it's caused a lot of issues, as you can imagine. So it's something to be aware of, and just to be mindful of, that you may have to build in additional things into your templates to avoid these being deleted by other people trying to potentially clear up the console and tidy up behind you. As I said, I'm happy for this to be deleted, so I'm going to hit delete. It will delete my storage account, and it will clean up this stack from my console as well. Now, we've learnt the basics of the template, but we want to do a bit of a more realistic or complex environment. So if we head back into my Visual Studio Code, what I have here is a more complex template that we can actually start to build out and look a bit like a realistic something you would deploy in your environment. So again, we have different sections inside this template. At the very start, we have the format version and we have a description. Again, we're following best practices and having a description so that I remember what this template does, and also if I'm sharing it with colleagues, then they know exactly what it does as well. This time though, we have parameters included in this template because we're actually going to be deploying out a virtual machine or an EC2 instance inside AWS. So there's a bit more information that we have to provide within the template so the deployment can actually happen. So the first one we're going to actually define is our availability zone. So we want to build in some redundancy into this virtual machine that we're deploying and actually scope it out within another availability zone inside our AWS region. Now, my second parameter is my AMI ID. Now, this is the Amazon machine image, and that's what you would use, and that's what you have to use within every EC2 instance. So you have to define what operating system you're going to use. In this example, I'm just picking a basic one, which is the Amazon Linux operating system, or AMI image. You could potentially have a Windows one here, you could have a Ubuntu one, you could have a Red Hat one. There's lots of different images within the AWS console that you can pick. One thing to watch here though is not every region has the same AMIs available. So every region has slightly differences, and you may have a different reference code or ID that you have to use if you're deploying within the region. So this is relevant to the region I'm deploying. So this is what my template looks like. What we've also done here is specified a default value for this parameter. So when I deploy this template, I could put in a different AMI ID. However, if I didn't know what AMI ID I wanted to use, the template will predefine that for me, and it will always default to this one for me. So again, if I didn't know what to do, if I wasn't sure, didn't know where to find that information, the template would take care of it for me. It's provided that information because we need it every time we deploy an EC2 instance. Now, the next parameter is around the key pair, and a key pair is used to allow me to access this resource. So it's the username and password ultimately that I can use if I wanted to SSH, in this case, into this EC2 instance. Now, we need to make sure that that key pair is created before we actually deploy this template. That has to be in place before we deploy this template. Now, the next parameter is my instance type, or ultimately the size of my virtual machine. How much compute do I want to give it? How much RAM do I want it to have? How much storage? All of those kind of configuration items within my instance or virtual machine. Now, again, I have a default value here, which is the T2 micro, which is the smallest machine and the lowest cost. I actually believe this is a free one that you can take advantage of. However, what I've also defined for this parameter is allowed values. And I'm saying that you can have two allowed values. So you can either define T2 micro or T2 small within this template. Anything out with that, the template will fail to deploy. These are the only two allowed values inside the instance type parameter. So again, if I didn't know which one I wanted to pick, it would default to T2 micro. But if I knew which one I wanted to pick, I have those two options. And we'll show you how that works inside Octopus Deploy in a minute. The last parameter I have here is environment type. Now, this is just a string that I'm actually using, and I'll be pulling in the information to help me name resources later on inside my deployment. So we've got a variety of different parameters showing you the capabilities that you can use inside this template. Now, the next section is all around my resources. It's all about the bits and bobs that I need for my EC2 instance to actually run inside AWS. So this first one here is actually my EC2 instance. So I'm taking all of the parameter information, so the availability zone, the AMI ID, the instance type, the key pair, and I'm also defining my security group here as well. What I want to show you here, though, is this section here, the user data. This will run once the EC2 instance has been created, and it will start to actually configure things inside that EC2 instance for me. In this example, it's actually going to install Apache onto this virtual machine for me, start it, and then actually create a small little website that we should hopefully be able to hit once we deploy this template out. So I'm going to pre-build my EC2 instance with the operating system on it, have Apache installed on it, and then actually create me a small website as well. So it's quite clever that you can templatize all of this for you in your deployments. Now, my next section is my security group, or my kind of networking group, and allowing certain ports open from certain destinations or sources. Now, again, the eagle-eyed among you will be noticing that I'm opening up port 80 and port 22. These are probably the most unsecure ports that you could open up to the internet. However, as this is a demo and I want to keep it simple for you, I'm opening those ports up. Port 80 for the website and port 22 for my SSH access if I needed it. In production, you would definitely not do this, or I wouldn't recommend it, and I definitely wouldn't recommend that you open these ports up to the internet. But it just shows you the ability that you have, again, to control what's happening outside of the EC2 instance, and something you need to do as well for the EC2 instance to run, because there's no point ultimately having this EC2 instance running in your AWS environment if you can't access it from anywhere or do anything with it. Now, you'll see the name of my security group, or the group name, is going to actually be appended with that parameter. So there's that environment type parameter that I'll be feeding in. So I'll probably use something like test or production or development, and that'll form part of the name of that as well. So you can see there I'm using that parameter to name resources that are being deployed later on. The last resource that I'll deploy is an elastic IP address, or a EIP as it's called. And this again is a public IP address that will allow me to access that website or that EC2 instance and control it as well. So that's the last component inside my template in terms of resources. Now I have my output section here, and it's going to be outputting my IP address. So I'll be able to hit that IP address and check that the website is up and running within it as well. So I definitely want that output to be coming back from me once this template is deployed. Now this time, we're not going to head over to the AWS console to deploy this. We're actually going to head over to my Octopus instance to actually deploy this template out and have a look at doing it that way. So here's my Octopus environment, and hopefully this is a familiar environment to you. However, if not, let me give you a quick brief overview. Now this is our management console for Octopus Deploy. At the top, we have our menu systems that will allow us to interact with various different components inside Octopus Deploy, and that will start to change as we go into it. So if we hit on infrastructure, we then get a menu system down the left-hand side that we can actually interrogate other parts as well and configure other parts of Octopus for us. Now, if we go into accounts, this is one of the first bits that you'll need to do when you fire up your Octopus environment. You'll have to connect your AWS, your Azure, your GCP, your data center here so that Octopus can actually talk to that environment. So I've already added in my AWS account and I've given it the right permissions. So Octopus now has the right permissions to create or delete or read items and resources inside my AWS environment. It's really quite simple to do that. You would just click on Add Account, pick the right one and fill in the information that it requires. If you're unsure at any point when you're creating a new account, there are links to go off to our documentation that will explain it all for you. Now, the second bit that I've configured is the environment section. So I've set up a test environment area and a production environment area so that I can kind of segment off different parts, and hopefully the names give it away. I'll have the test environment where I can play. I'm happy to deploy things, tear them down if things go wrong. They're in that section. And obviously my production environment will be slightly different, and will be a bit more secure, hopefully, in terms of what I'm doing. The other bit that I have pre-built is under library and inside variable sets for you. I've got a variable set here called AWS that has a lot of information inputted that I'll be calling when I'm deploying that template that we just walked through. So we can see here, I've got my availability zone item ready defined. So I've defined that I'm using the US East 1A availability zone when I'm deploying my templates. I've inputted an instance type variable. And as you can see, I have those two allowed values, that T2 small and T2 micro. What I've done here is actually scope these. So I'm saying that every time I'm deploying to test, I want to use the T2 micro instance type or size of my virtual machine. And then for production, I'm going to use T2 small because that's slightly bigger and I want it to be more reliable when I'm deploying into production. Again, I have a scoped variable for my key pair name. I'm calling something different from my production one and my test one. I've also got my region defined here. So when I'm deploying my template, I can use that and call that. I don't have to remember what that configuration is. And last but not least, I have my stack name. So what is the name of that stack deployment going to be called when I go into the AWS portal for it? You'll notice here, I'm actually using a built-in variable from inside Octopus. So what this does is actually will reference my environment name. So remember, I created a test environment and a production environment. It will pull in the name of that depending on where I'm deploying it to. So if I'm deploying it to test, ultimately this variable would be EC2-test, and the same for production, obviously, just instead of production. So what we want to do is head over to projects, and I have a project called AWS CloudFormation. Inside Runbooks, you'll see that I already have a couple of Runbooks set up. So I actually have one that would deploy that storage template that we saw. So if we click on that and click on process, we can see here I'm doing two simple stages to actually deploy that template. I'm just deploying that template and then I'm printing the outputs. If we have a look at a run that I did earlier on, we can see that when that ran, it outputted and printed those values on my screen here. So again, there's different ways we can pull from the template. What I want to do though is build a brand new runbook to deploy that EC2 instance. So if we click on add runbook, and we'll call it create virtual machine and click save. We want to start to define what our runbook looks like. So if we click on runbook process, and our first step is actually deploy the template. So here we have a bunch of community steps that either we at Octopus have created or a community have created. And it should have everything that you need here. So if there's something that you're trying to do, whether that be in AWS, Amazon, Azure, Google Cloud, or on a Windows server, the step there will be there for you, and you don't necessarily have to start to create all of that. So as we're working in AWS, let's click on AWS, and we get a bunch of options here. What I want to first do is actually deploy create my key pair. So I'll click on run an AWS CLI script, because interestingly enough, I haven't found a way of being able to create a key pair with a CloudFormation template. So we'll say create key pair. Now we're going to leave a lot of the default options. However, I want to change the worker pool that I'm using. I have a Windows server sitting at the back end that has a bunch of AWS tools installed on it that will help Octopus carry out all of these steps for me. So we'll pick on that one, and then we'll slide on down to configure the AWS account that we want to use. So I'll click on here and click on that AWS account that I've predefined that we saw earlier on. My next question is, what region do I actually want to deploy to? And as you saw, we have a variable. So what we'll do is we'll pick on that variable, and that will define that for me. Inside the code, what we actually want to run here is a small little script using the AWS CLI, which will ultimately just create my key pair using the parameter that we saw earlier on again. So we'll click Done. Now we want to add a second step. We want to actually deploy that template that we had. So if we click on AWS again, and this time we want to pick Deploy an AWS CloudFormation Template. So we'll give it a name here and we'll call it Create EC2 Instance. Again, I'm going to pick my Windows worker, which has my AWS tools installed on it to run this. Again, defining my AWS account. I'll use my region variable here. I'll define my stack name. I'm going to skip out the AMI role. As I said, when we were doing it through the AWS CloudFormation console, it's not necessarily best practice to do it this way. However, we're trying to build up our knowledge and learn as we go. So we'll leave that empty for the moment. We've also got the option here. Remember we saw inside the AWS CloudFormation console, you could add tags. We could add on additional tags to help identify our resources. So we have the same options inside Octopus Deploy that we saw inside the AWS console as well. So you're not missing out by using Octopus. You're actually gaining some functionality by doing it this way as well. So when we are looking at defining where the source is, we have a slightly different setup than we saw within the AWS console. Now, we could put in the source code directly, so we could copy that template from my Visual Studio Code and paste that into this section. Or I could actually upload the file into the Octopus Deploy repository and pull out from there. So we could do that. Or we could pull it from an S3 bucket. So you have an additional option here to do this. What I'm actually going to do is actually use the source code. So if I switch over to my Visual Studio Code again, select all of that, and then paste that in. That template is now part of this step inside Octopus. What we'll do is if we scroll down, we now have an additional section here that's been created because Octopus has read the template and realized there's a bunch of parameters we need to define for this template. So for availability zone, we're going to pick our availability zone variable. We've got that default item that we saw for our AMI inside the template. So I'm going to leave that as, so I'm quite happy with that. I'm going to define my key pair. My instance type has been deployed or been set as default because that's what's been read from the template. However, I don't want to do that. I want to use that variable that I created. So if we type in the variable, which was AWS instance type, it'll pull in that variable for us and not use that default that was inside the template. And last but not least, we want to define our environment type. So for here, I'm going to pull on again, that internal built-in variable that will pull in the environment name for us. And last but not least, I want a step that will print out my outputs. So it will give me the IP address of my virtual machine that's been deployed. So as I can check that the website that I configured on it has actually ran. So I'm going to click on Script and click on Run a Script. So we'll say print outputs. We'll run this once on one of my worker pools. And again, we're going to define the script. So I have a small PowerShell script that pulls out the outputs that will be given when the second step runs, and then it will actually write them out for us in a readable format for a human being and be able to click on it, hopefully. So we'll put that in and we'll click Save. So I've now built my runbook. I've got those 3 steps. I create my key pair, I then create the instance using that CloudFormation template, and then I'm printing the output so that I can check it and check that everything's ran. So let's hit run. And I have the option here to pick on which environment I want to run it in. I'm going to pick test this time. If I was to wanting to, say, schedule this runbook to run at, say, 2 AM or 3 AM because I want to define that, or deploy those resources then, I have the option to schedule this for either now or later on. And we have a bunch of other options that we could use within this runbook. As I want to show you this happening now, I'm going to leave that as now and hit run. So this will now start to work through those 3 steps. And if we have a look at the task log, it'll start to give us a bit more information. So we'll change it to verbose as we get lots of information. Now it's already created my key pair for me, and I've got all of the information for the key pair there as well. I potentially want to do something different with that because having that visible is not the most secure way. But again, this is just a quick demo. So this is just showing the art of the possible. And now it's working on actually creating my EC2 instance. What you'll notice at the bottom here as it updates is it's doing very similar things to what we saw inside that AWS CloudFormation console. It's working through the various different stages, it's creating my resources and giving me an alert as to where it is in that action. Now, it should only take 2 minutes, fingers crossed, because this is how long it's been taken when I've been demoing it and running through this in the background. So we'll let that run for a minute or 2 and come back to it. So folks, that's it, created that resource. So as you can see here from the kind of notation in the log, it worked through all the various different resources and has created it. Now, as you'll see here, it saved those outputs. So those templates gave me those 2 outputs, the stack ID and the website URL, the IP address, and it's actually saved it inside a Octopus variable. And that's ultimately what I've called inside my 3rd step, my print output step. So we're pulling the variables from this step and printing them out. And if we expand this, we should see, so we've got public IP address, and I can click on that, and then I've got the stack ID because it's showing me those outputs that were from the variables. So if we click on this IP address, we should see, and there you go, my small little website that says, hello from Sarah in Scotland. So that's my EC2 instance running inside AWS with Apache already installed, a small website or web page created on it, and we're now viewing it live, and it's actually worked. So that's me being able to deploy a template inside AWS, the management portal, and also from Octopus Deploy as well. So folks, that's us started our learning journey with AWS CloudFormation. We've started to learn how to build and create those templates. We've understood the various different components that you could potentially see inside a template as well. What you need to now have a look at is trying the demo yourself and building on your knowledge. There's a lot of other things that you can do with AWS CloudFormation. You want to start maybe looking at change sets, which is when you start to take a template and then make changes to it later on. So if you were to change how the configuration was, add on additional steps, add on additional resources, looking at those conditions and transforms inside the templates. And then hopefully building on that knowledge and looking at actually source controlling all of your templates and doing exactly what you do with your software code as you do want to do with your infrastructure as code. So you want to store it somewhere like GitHub with source control, and potentially doing some testing on your templates for validation before deployment, and looking at that whole process of deploying infrastructure as code from start to finish with a CI/CD pipeline, just the same way that you do with your software code as well. If you want to take the templates that I use today, please head to the URL on screen and you'll get a copy of the templates, and you can take them and you can build on them, or you can use them as a demo and work through them as well. There's other information there about learning more in depth about AWS CloudFormation, and again, starting to build on your knowledge as well. If you are using AWS CloudFormation with Octopus Deploy and you maybe have some questions or you have some issues, please reach out to our advice team. They will be happy to help you and spend some time, again, helping you on that learning journey and fixing any problems that you may have. They're a great team. I picked their brains a few times as well, so do reach out to them and ask them for their questions. Derek, I don't know if we've had any questions for the audience or if you've got any questions, but yeah, hopefully we're at that section where the audience have questions for me.
Yeah, they do. So first up, that was awesome, Sarah. I learned a bunch. I'm a bit like yourself. I'm definitely more Azure than AWS. Thank you very much. That was a really great presentation. So, got a question from Sally. Sally is asking, how did you find learning AWS CloudFormation versus other infrastructure as code languages?
Um, I think it was fairly typical of what you expect when you learn an infrastructure as code language, and especially using YAML, because I've been focusing on YAML stuff quite a bit. I think it's logical, and I think if you do have experience of learning another infrastructure as code language, whether that be Terraform, Bicep, whatever it may be, the logic is still there and you can understand what's happening and pick up those different key sections, because I think every infrastructure as code language will have those key sections that we talked about inside the presentation. We'll have the description, the name, we'll have parameters, we'll have resources, and we'll have outputs, and there'll be a few other bits in between. So it's fairly straightforward, and there's a lot of resources out there to help you, a lot of examples and other people sharing their knowledge as well. So fairly typical, not hard, but yeah, good experience overall.
Awesome, awesome. I think you probably know my thoughts on YAML. Super reusable, but oh lordy, is it a little bit frustrating at times? No, that was really awesome. To be honest, it looked quite similar, to all the other ones that I've worked. Like you say, you've got your parameters, you've got obviously the templates, etc. So yeah, no, that was really great. Can I still manage my resources if I use CloudFormation to create them? So obviously within the portal, you can create your resources in the portal, but if you're using CloudFormation, can you still manage those resources?
Yeah, you can do. So for example, that virtual machine that I created, that EC2 instance, I could go into the graphical user interface portal and start to change the settings and add in different bits and things like that. Obviously, if you start to do that, your templates are going to be out of sync with what your settings have done. So it depends on your needs, but yes, you can still interact with them. You don't need to change the settings through a template all the time, but just be wary if you are changing settings in the portal that maybe add or remove features, you're going to have to watch with the drift that will happen with your templates and for future deployments.
Yeah, I think that's a really good. To be honest, with it, I generally find you either use the UI or infrastructure as code. Try and avoid overcomplicating things. So that's a great little bit there. So someone is asking, can they use CloudFormation with Chef or Terraform?
Yeah, you can still integrate if you're creating your virtual machines and you have configuration with Chef or Puppet or even Terraform. Actually, you can still bootstrap into CloudFormation and those third-party tools as well. So there's different integrations that you can use. So definitely have a look at the documentation. AWS do have some great documentation on that, and it's great to be able to use those tools you're already using and complement them with CloudFormation as well.
Awesome. Is there any cost for using CloudFormation with AWS?
Not necessarily. No, it's free if you're using the AWS providers, and obviously you'll have to pay for the resources that you deploy. It starts to get a bit trickier if you're using third-party resource providers with AWS CloudFormation. But for the most part, and for what I've demoed today, that's free to use it. Ultimately, I pay for that storage account and virtual machine that I deployed. But yeah, CloudFormation on the whole is free. It's not an additional cost for you using it.
Awesome, awesome. I have a question from Megashri.
Mhm.
Do you know how to securely create key pair as the private key is visible in the CLI output? Or was that not the public key that came out?
There was a key visible. I haven't actually double checked what came out of it, to be honest, because of the format that it came out on. It is something that I want to look into because, like you say, it was publicly visible to everybody. Not necessarily that's an issue inside your organization, although that's probably something your auditors will pick up on. I'd definitely like to do something better with that and figure out how to do that. Probably store it inside secret management or actually use the secure encrypted variables inside Octopus to do it. So yeah, there's definitely some flaws in things that I did, but given that I'm still on that learning journey and beginning it, I'm going to not be too hard on myself for some of those things.
You've done great. It was a great introductory session, and that's exactly what we came up with. So honestly, that was fantastic, Sarah. I learned a bunch as well. I'm sure everyone else did. Unfortunately, that's the end of today's questions. We are in the last 60 seconds, so that seems like a good time to wrap up. Okay, so big thank you to Sarah. That was really great. I really enjoyed it. A big thank you to for those who came along. A recording will be emailed to you in the next 24 to 48 hours. We do have another upcoming webinar with myself and Pete Gallagher where we're introducing config as code. That is on May 4th. For those Star Wars geeks out with you, may the config as code be with you. Join us and sign up before the 4th of May. Please do get along. That's going to be an absolute killer webinar, I believe. Sarah, again, thank you. And thank you everyone else. Enjoy the rest of your day.